Hello everyone, my name is Geetanjali Sharma. I am a graduate of Cambridge University, having specialized in international economic laws and dispute settlement. I am here today to present the module on Trade Facilitation Agreement. To begin with, I will provide a brief structure to my module. First, we shall look into the meaning and the evolution of the concept of trade facilitation. Second, we will be looking into the current framework of the WTO rules and regulations on trade facilitation. Thereafter, we shall be discussing the legal developments that have happened in the recent past, especially in the adoption of a trade facilitation agreement as being a standalone agreement in the WTO. Thereafter, we will be looking into specific aspects and key provisions of the trade facilitation agreement as it stands being negotiated in the World Trade Organization. Thereafter, we shall discuss some of the predicted benefits of the proposed trade facilitation agreement and present to you the current controversy that's happening in the adoption of the agreement and the tussle between the developing and the developed world. To begin with, we first analyze the need to have a separate agreement on trade facilitation. It's often been seen that traders from both the developing and the developed world have felt the lack of transparency and the lack of cooperation that exists between the traders and the respective state official agencies with which they are trading. All of this inevitably leads to certain costs in the business, which affects the supply chain and increases other recurring costs and inventory costs. With this, we've seen that a lot of developments, especially in the private realm of international trade, has been taking place, and therefore, to advocate and make use of the technology that's existing and reduce these costs and uncertainties, there has been a constant effort even at the WTO and other foray at public international law forums to enhance the current rules on trade facilitation and make trade more business friendly and efficient. Therefore, in the recent past, the need for trade facilitation has clearly been felt. Now, we take a brief overview of the existing rules on trade facilitation as they exist today, having been negotiated during the GATT 1947 era. 3 articles of GATT 1947 become relevant for our analysis today. The first is Article 5, which deals with freedom of transit of goods from another member states and the rule that all charges that are imposed on such a transit must be reasonable in nature. The second rule pertains to the fees and formalities that are connected with the importation and exportation of the goods and how the charging of such services must be maintained. The last and most vital provision of GATT 1947, which lays a vital foundation for the current trade facilitation agreement being negotiated, is Article 10, which pertains to the publication and administration of trade regulation. Now, we shall look at each of these agreements and the existing framework in a bit more detail. First, begin with Article 5. The terms of Article 5 indicate that states must not hinder in the traffic in transit by imposing either unnecessary delays or restricting the transit of goods by imposing unreasonable charges. The obligation that becomes relevant here is the most favored nation treatment that must be granted to transit of goods across member states. Second, Article 8 of GATT 1947 further limits the costs and complexities involved in the import and export process. It's explicitly recognized that there is a need to reduce the number and complexity of export and import related fees and formalities. However, the current agreement as it stands in Article 8 does not provide for a legal mandate to do so. And here we see how the current trade facilitation agreement is stepping in, as I shall discuss in the course of my presentation. The current agreement being negotiated provides for mandatory framework, taking the mandate of Article 8 ahead in making these rules more concrete. Now, we look into Article 10 of the GATT agreement, which pertains to rules in the publication of the trade laws, which ought to be done in a prompt and accessible manner, and the requirement that members must refrain from enforcing measures prior to publication and to administer measures only in a uniform, impartial and reasonable manner. We see that the contours of Article 10 is quite wide in nature. However, Article 10 does lack the practical provisions to set out rules pertaining to publicizing laws and regulations, and further nuanced issues such as establishment of inquiry points and advance rulings or even appeal procedures, which go on to strengthen the mandate of transparency, predictability and uniformity within the World Trade Organization. And therefore, the analysis of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which is ongoing today, also becomes relevant as it takes the mandate of Article 10, similar to the mandate of Article 8, forward in building these rules in a more concretized manner. We've looked into the main reasons for the evolution of Trade Facilitation Agreement as have been highlighted in terms of uncertainty in business costs, advances in information technology, and the inadequacy of the existing framework. Now, we look into the legal developments and the current legal status of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Trade Facilitation Agreement owes its origin to the Singapore Conference, where it emerged as a Singapore issue as evidenced from paragraph 21. Thereafter, it became a topic of discussion during the Doha rounds as it was incorporated in the July package of 2004. The July package 2004 had clear rules that there is a need to strengthen the mandate of Article 5, 8 and 10 of the existing GATT framework, and also strengthen the rules pertaining to the special and differential treatment that must be accorded to the members. We see that this advancement is being felt as the current negotiation of Trade Facilitation Agreement as it stands today takes care of these requirements. Thereafter, the October 2004 meeting, where a WTO negotiating group on trade facilitation was formed, also becomes very vital in the analysis of how the current agreement is shaping up. Most recently, in the 9th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization held in Bali in December 2013, the adoption of Trade Facilitation Agreement was much discussed. Here, the members concretized the rules and drew up 90% of what has to go in the final words of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. However, the date on which it was supposed to be adopted, which is July 31st, 2014, has been passed, and therefore the current status of the agreement is that it remains unenforceable as of date. We shall now move on to discuss the reasons why the Trade Facilitation Agreement as on date has not been enforced. But before moving to that, I would like to state that the legal status of the Trade Facilitation Agreement in the context of the larger WTO agreement must be understood as it would be added as an annexure, as an amendment to the current rules of WTO agreement by way of Annex 1A of the agreement, and saying that it would be a separate agreement in itself would mean that the proper amendment procedure requiring 2/3 of majority mandate of countries would be required before the agreement is finally enforced and ratified by member states. We now move on to discuss the current situation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Having said that during the Bali Ministerial Conference in December 2013, the members drew up most of the provisions of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, members also decided to set the deadline for 31st July 2014 for the adoption of the Protocol on Trade Facilitation Agreement. However, this deadline as of today stands missed as member states including India, backed by Cuba, Venezuela and Bolivia, declined to sign the agreement. In this much controversial move on the part of India, India's main opposition with the Trade Facilitation Agreement mainly arises as the agreement caps the yearly subsidies in developing countries at 10% of the value of agricultural production. It must be noted that India, both during and since the Bali round of negotiations, had opposed any limit to such a capping on subsidies and demanded that a parallel pact which would allow the developing countries to continue subsidizing and stockpiling of food is required. Therefore, a temporary truce was reached in Bali last year as the WTO members agreed not to file complaints against India's food subsidy program until a permanent solution is worked out by December 2017. However, India, not happy with this peace clause, demanded a more immediate solution to the problem, preferably by the end of 2014, in exchange of signing the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Since this issue has gone in a deadlock, India's demands having not been fulfilled, the Trade Facilitation Agreement as of today does not stand enforced. Clearly, there is an evident lack of consensus on this issue, which is leading to the stalling of the enforcement process. With a basic overview of the economics and politics behind the Trade Facilitation Agreement, we now enter into the legal aspect of the analysis of some of the relevant terms of the Trade Facilitation Agreement as have been incorporated in the draft form. The agreement mainly has two sections, sections 1 and 2, and an overall intent behind the Trade Facilitation Agreement is to simplify and harmonize international trade procedures, with trade procedures being activities, practice and formalities involved in the collection, presentation, communication and processing of data required for a free movement of goods and services in international trade. Therefore, the ambit of the trade facilitation is quite wide in nature and requires to simplify the procedure of movement of goods in international world trade. A brief overview of section 1 of the Trade Facilitation Agreement indicates that the agreement is far-reaching in nature and provides for publication and consultation, appeal and review, freedom of transit, advance rulings and several other easing procedures for improving the manner in which trade is done. Now, we shall go on to discuss a few relevant provisions of Trade Facilitation Agreement and how they provide an advancement for traders and other stakeholders involved in international trade. First, the agreement provides for certain mandatory rules on publication of information. It involves the novel concept of issuing advance rulings, and there have been clear rules for penalties and breaches that will be imposed, the knowledge of which would be given to the traders adequately and in advance. There are certain rules for dealing with perishable goods, as a lot of trade gets affected if perishable goods are not treated properly while in transit or during the trade process. There is also a provision for creating a single window transmission system which will ease out a lot of formalities and procedures involved in international trade. Overall, the advancement of the Trade Facilitation Agreement is to provide a more transparent and prompt mechanism towards the practices of international trade. Discussing a few aspects on the publication and availability of information, we see that the relevant rules in the Trade Facilitation Agreement deals with the publication and availability of information pertaining to a wide variety of activities, including, for example, importation, exportation and transit procedures, applied rates of duties and taxes, rules for classification and valuation of products, fees and charges imposed in connection with importation, exportation or transit, the laws, regulations and administrative rulings pertaining to the rules of origin, penalty provisions regarding breaches of such formalities, the appeal procedure and the agreements with countries relating to such procedures. Procedures relating to the administration of tariff quota also find a mention within this ambit. Therefore, we see that the scope of this provision is very vast in nature, and it is both forward looking and backward looking in a way that countries that have entered into prior agreements with other countries pertaining to easing out procedures of international trade would continue to remain in existence, and the current trade facilitation agreement recognizes the need to take into account those agreements and further provide for a better framework for other countries that do not have such agreements in place. Now we move on to discuss the provision of advance rulings. Now, advance rulings are binding decisions by custom authorities at the request of the person concerned on specific aspects of goods, in particular the classification and origin of goods in the preparation for importation or exportation. Therefore, such advance rulings facilitate the declaration and consequently ease the release and clearance process. The trade facilitation agreement, as in the draft form today, requires the members to endeavour towards establishment of a single window to enable traders to submit documentation for importation, exportation and transit through a single entry point to the participating authorities and agencies. Therefore, the provision on advance rulings and single window clearance system provide further ease for traders and other actors in international trade. Now, some of the proposed benefits of such provisions, such as the benefits accruing from advance rulings, would include the fact that advance rulings would be issued in a reasonable and time-bound manner. The applicant would be requested to submit in writing the necessary information and explain in writing the relevant facts as to why that advance ruling has been issued or the advance rulings has been declined against the person. Now, to guarantee that such advance rulings for a reasonable period and a time-bound manner is maintained, therefore, these rules are further nuanced provisions that strengthen the publication and transparency mandate that was erstwhile existing in Article 10 of GATT 1947. Now we move on to discuss some of the vital provisions of transit of goods. The provision on transit of goods encourages member states to provide physical separation between traffic in transit and other imports, for example, by the use of special lanes, berths or similar infrastructure. Transit of goods also would ensure that formalities, documentation and requirements on traffic would no more be burdensome than necessary to identify the goods and ensure fulfillment of transit requirements. The provisions also require member states to allow for advance rulings and processing of transit documents, and member states would also be required to terminate the transit operation promptly once the traffic in transit has reached the destination where it exists in the territory of the member state. Moving on, the Trade Facilitation Agreement also sets out provision for customs cooperation and institutional arrangements. For example, it must be noted that WTO member countries that have entered into such cooperation agreements on a bilateral or a plurilateral levels will continue to be recognized by the agreement, and the value of these bilateral and plurilateral efforts will not prevent the members from further entering into such agreements, or their rights and obligations under such agreements remains unaltered. Therefore, the agreement is forward looking and also takes into account the prior commitments that members have made at a bilateral or a plurilateral level. We now move on to discuss the various policy considerations behind the rules, some of which I have discussed with you in the initial part of my presentation. We see that most of these rules take the mandate of impartiality, non-discrimination and transparency forward. They aim to strengthen customs cooperation and also complement the existing rules that members have committed on a plurilateral and a bilateral level, and it also strengthens the overall institutional framework required for the process of international trade. Having discussed the contours and the nature and scope of Section 1 of the agreement, we briefly discuss Section 2 of the Trade Facilitation Agreement that has provisions for special and differential treatment. We must understand that the current framework of the Trade Facilitation Agreement makes a three-pronged categorization of countries. For instance, certain countries have been given the category of A, where commitments to those countries are such that a member state has designated for implementation upon entry into force of the agreement. In the sense, for the category A members, the commitments will depend only on an implementation date that members have defined and set for themselves. Similarly, for category B, commitments are those that a member state has designated for implementation on a date after such a transitional period has been completed. Finally, there is a category C, where commitments are those where member state has designated for implementation a date after a transition date and the acquisition of implementation capacity through the provision of technical assistance and support for capacity building. Therefore, based on the needs of the country and their ability to implement the agreement as and when their socio-economic infrastructure permits them to do so, members have been given that leeway to enter into different dates for executing and implementing this commitment. The rules also provide that it is for the developing countries and the least developed country to self-designate itself on an individual basis and then demarcate as to which category of provision applies to it on which specific date. This, the agreement provides, has to be done on a negative list basis, in which a country will specifically identify and notify to the WTO its category B and category C commitments. Any commitment not notified will be deemed to follow under category A, which is the category of automatically implementable provisions. For category C commitments, each country concerned will seek from the donor agency the technical assistance and requisite capacity building with a view of securing an agreement to provide it. Therefore, the rules not only provide a classification of different categories, but also provide the member countries the leeway to self-designate and choose for themselves which commitment they wish to undertake at which given stage. Furthermore, the S&D provisions, which are the special and differential treatment provisions, recognize the technical assistance delivery is a precondition for a mandatory implementation and compliance of obligations which have been assigned in category C. Therefore, it is vital to note that while the agreement is subject to dispute settlement rules, different grade periods are defined for different category of commitments, and they would be subject to dispute settlement as and when they become executable for each member state. Finally, the agreement also formulates a notification procedure for technical assistance delivery by donor country members and other country members to provide technical assistance for the implementation of this agreement. Overall, we see that the agreement, with its specific and defined rules along with greater flexibilities under the special and differential regime, becomes a highly business friendly model. Its business friendliness could be understood in various ways in which the agreement has designed itself. First, an understanding when a country intends to implement a commitment gives business an indication as to when they can expect trade facilitation improvements, and this would avoid creating unrealistic explanations or expectations on part of the investors. Second, the publication of schedules exposes a country to stakeholder scrutiny. For example, business may know of existing reforms in the country that are not reflected in the scheduled implementation timetables. Therefore, the gap that existed between the trading agencies and the traders will be reduced. It may also be possible to implement the consultation and dialogue obligations earlier than the commitments that are more technical or that require changes in national laws or regulations. This would enable business to discuss implementation with national committees and raise the possibility for business to contribute towards technical assistance and capacity building support of the countries. Therefore, the amalgamation of the government, business and private traders is one of the best methods in which the agreement has been designed to provide the best results to all the stakeholders involved. Now, moving on to discuss the predicted benefits that accrue out of the agreement. Several projections by institutions such as OECD or the World Bank have been made, which define that costs for saving, the costs involved out of the trade facilitation agreement would be reduced to the extent that the real dividends which would be paid very soon will overcome these costs and other barriers. For instance, the OECD estimates indicate that for every 1% reduction in global trade cost, global income goes up to 40 billion US dollars. Similarly, the trade facilitation agreement also holds the potential to cut trade costs by almost 14.5% of low income countries and 10% for high income groups. Therefore, despite the predicted gains, we've seen that the reason why there is a current impasse in the execution of this agreement is because of an evaluation of its gains versus the concerns. Now, the concerns for implementation are also several. First, the concerns accruing out of costs become severe because countries believe that especially the developing countries believe that the amount of money that would be invested in having the set infrastructure in place would be a lot more than the actual benefits they would gain out of the agreement, as the agreement will mainly facilitate trade and ease out the benefits for the developed world that will be able to improve its imports into the developing world. Therefore, the cost benefit analysis is problematic, especially when seen from the perspective of developing countries. More importantly and more controversially, the fact that the trade facilitation agreement is intertwined with other thorny issues of international trade, for example, the agreement on agriculture, which raises several food security concerns, is also a major problematic area in the execution of this agreement. It must be noted that the Bali round of negotiations have also involved within its scope issues such as public stockholding for food security, list of general services including the agreement on agriculture, tariff rate quota administration, export competition and two other sections of trade facilitation which pertain to these issues. Now, the developing countries including India have not been able to abide by and respect the rules of trade facilitation agreement, as they directly affect public stockholding for food security. Now, the rules on public stockholding food security emanates from the agreement on agriculture, which considers the differences between price and historical low price flowing from the 1986 to 1988 benchmark would amount to a subsidy. even if the purchase is made at market prices. Now, the new WTO agreement limits the value of food subsidies at 10% of the total food grain production. India, on the other hand, has raised the concern that because subsidies have been calculated by the WTO, taking 1986 as the base year into account, this is an outdated numerical concept which would largely affect food procurement programs that India has executed through the minimum support pricing. And therefore, in the views of developing countries, including India, this would severely affect their food security concerns when the developed countries will continue to maintain different forms of subsidies as per their negotiation in the Uruguay rounds of the WTO, but the developing world will be subject to the new rule of 10%. Now, several legal and political commentators have indicated that during the Uruguay round of negotiations, developing countries could not receive an equivalent deal as to the developed countries, especially on the issues of agriculture, subsidies and intellectual property rights. Therefore, today when the Bali package is being negotiated, similar to the Uruguay round of negotiation, we've seen that several of these apprehensions are resurfacing on part of the developing countries as they are unable to accept the trade facilitation agreement, which is to be implemented and executed as a part of a package agreement. Therefore, their stand is quite clear that unless issues that are not beneficial to their interest pertaining to issues such as food security and flowing from agreement on agriculture are not given proper consideration on the part of developed world, their specific needs from the trade facilitation agreement of easing out trade and making trade more facilitative from the point of view of traders would not be bargained during the current round of negotiations. And all of this has led to a severe impasse as of today the agreement stands unenforced, and the future of this uncertainty is still not known. Having said this, I would now like to conclude my presentation by mainly summarizing the issues that have been touched upon in this module. First, we have discussed the nature of trade facilitation and the manner in which there has been a need felt for a separate trade facilitation agreement. We have discussed the various legal developments in the evolution of a trade facilitation agreement and how the two sections of the trade facilitation agreement, namely the ones dealing with procedural and transparency issues and the one dealing with special and differential treatment, tend to make a great improvement in the existing WTO framework as envisaged under Articles 5, 8 and 10 of CAT 1947 agreement. We have also discussed the economic and political issues surrounding the trade facilitation agreement and the reasons why it has achieved an impasse as of today, and we also conclude that the future of this agreement remains a bit uncertain, even though the legal provisions and the legal text of the agreement to a very great extent has been finalized and negotiated. Thank you.